Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining me once again as I continue our weekly discussions based on the book, The Integral Human Being. And we are today on chapter 9, which is a chapter dedicated to myths. Yes, you heard me right. And before I go there, I just wanted to remind everyone that this amazing collection of books, it's known as the Psychology Series or a Psychology Collection, is a 16-book series written by the spiritual author Joanna de Angelis in collaboration with Divaldo Pereira Franco. And what fascinates me is that Joanna de Angelis created this bridge between Spiritism and depth psychology. And we meet weekly to discuss some of the issues and even therapies offered in this book, chapter by chapter. And if we think about it, how vulnerable we are, we, as part of humanity as a whole, is just going through so much pain, so much suffering. And this book, as I think of it, is just a gift because it goes deeper into the usual discussions. So it actually highlights, identifies the root causes, and even identifies some solutions to many of our mental issues, our psychological issues. So the focus for us is to bring us our weekly topic found in this great little book. It's just tiny. And the ultimate goal is to ask ourselves, how do I make sure that I am well, that I have a sense of balance, stability, emotional maturity, despite what everything else is going on in my life? So as we continue our discussion here, and I like to bring for just a second or two the fact that the book is divided in 40 chapters, and those 40 chapters are then categorized or subdivided into 9 parts. Today's topic is myths, and we're going to discuss so much. Basic topics include fear, insecurity, mental illness, and my favorite one, ethical consciousness. And I invite you to continue this journey with me as Joanna de Angelis brings so much from those lenses of spiritism and depth psychology. So let's go ahead and get started today in earnest. And I could call it myths or myths and fairy tales and myths, fairy tales, traditions, all of those that are such a part of our awareness, our belief systems. But what is the relationship between mythology and psychology, you may ask? And I love to say or ask the fact that our psychologists, psychotherapists, right, analysts, taking the function of storytellers of the past. Just a thought for you to ponder. And I love a certain writer. If you don't know him, I would highly recommend that you get familiarized with Joseph Campbell. And I specifically just really find it beautiful, his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, because it brings, from mythological perspective, the hero's journey in mythology, right? So if we perhaps start this discussion about myths by thinking of what Joseph Campbell brings to us, this hero figure. And what is the hero? Well, hero in mythology or fairy tales or even movies, right? The hero is depicted by what? by his or her courage, by the daring exploits. We see the hero slaying dragons or slaying just monsters, and if you put in the very a very abstract manner, it just goes through the gamut, not just the beginning of our history as humanity, but up to today. Probably, if you turn on your I don't know, your streaming device, or your best most adorable book as a child, as a young adult, or as an adult, and you may most likely find that type of archetype, right? But in fairy tales, as in myth, that hero journey, the theme that we can see is that the hero is the chosen one, right? Or the king's son, the prince. We often see that. And the question for all of us here is, why do you think are those stories repeated over and over again? Different titles, different characters, but it's the same underlying story. Symbolically, it is a deeply introspective and inward looking adventure of the hero. Yeah, right? So the journey that the hero takes is one that is profoundly spiritual and has psychological implications. But if we were to summarize the hero's journey, we can see that through a very hard, very difficult type of challenge, a trial, the hero learns new things about himself or herself, right? And the hero starts to discover his or her hidden talent, strengths, anything that is it's there, but somehow they lie dormant within himself, herself, the entire time of this journey. So with these new but somewhat prior to the event, latent powers, we see through history, sorry, through the story, telling that the hero goes through this transformation. It is the journey of a hero to understand his external powers, right? The influence to that he or she has to the external environment, but also his or her own psyche. So from that perspective, that's why we're talking about myth here, because mythology and psychology are intimately related if we think from those terms. And as we view it, there's another component. Mythology is quite interesting because it has a deeply egalitarian component. What do I mean by that? It just, mythology tells us that who we are, right? Who we are in our potentiality, and what are the rewards that await us if we only set aside our focus on the day to day, the humdrum, the routine, the work that life pushes us, but also embrace that hero's journey. And I'm here, right? Because far from being just a literary character of long dead prime civilizations, right? But if we look at how it symbolizes the God, the divine that is potential, it's the potential that is within us. So now let's see, what does Joanna talks about, because as a typical Joanna, she brings us point counterpoint. She talks about the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly about this topic. And in this chapter, as it is expected, by the way, this is the last chapter of the second part of the book. So we are finalized this grouping of discussions to move on to another one. But it Joanna reminds us that the history of humanity is really closely tied to the myths. And she even tells us that is in many ways the history of humanity is also a consequence of the belief systems that we, you and I, human beings, part of the human race, have created, have elaborated in our mind for our own survival. Deep, deep stuff here, right? And let's think about it, because as we start to go to the next groupings of chapters coming up, we will discuss this further, how it is all coming together. So while when I started reading the book, I says, what are you talking about here? Why are you bringing mythology to this chapter? But it really makes start to make sense, right? And if we break the concept further, we're talking about what is Joanna talking about, right? So we start with an idea that myths, fairy tales, and traditions are there, and Joanna is saying yes, they're there, but we're really, really, really talking about fears, anxieties, ideals, aspirations, but also our pain and suffering, all wrapped up in this discussion about mythology, as well as our belief systems. So she goes on to say that myths are a, how shall I say, a representation of how our experience, specifically fear, anxiety, etc., how they become grouped, they become stereotyped in a type or a mythological figure, and really are expressive of where we are in our human stage, right? Our evolutionary stage. And that expression can be, of course, oral traditions, written traditions, drama, Greek. I keep thinking about Greek mythology, Greek drama, right? Theater, poetry, etc. So they all express our experience, leading with conflicts and leading with human emotions, to include our fears, our loss, our sense of anxiety, our idealized self, etc., etc. And some examples here include legends, right? Arthurian legends or traditions, or myths. And a good example that I wanted to bring to you, and she brings in the book as well, is how a Greek mythology specifically capture human conflicts in the form of a really grotesque, grotesque, cruel dramas, right? And so a good example is Zeus, the god, Zeus, Greek god, right? Is his revenge against Prometheus. And you may remember, right? But basically, the revenge of Zeus is that Prometheus was condemned to eternal punishment in a story of this anthropomorphized revenge. I'm tongue tied this morning, right? It's an anthropomorphic, revengeful, spiteful God. Yes, right. Think in terms, as I'm speaking about Greek mythology, there are a lot of others around us, including how in the biblical terms we think of God, right? This very fearful, spiteful, revengeful God. But if you don't remember the story itself, it's about this figure Prometheus, who his receives this terrible, terrible punishment. He, Prometheus, is chained to a boulder, and every day a vulture comes in and feeds on Prometheus' liver, and at night the liver grows back, right? And now next day he goes through the same punishment once again. He's ready to be eaten again by the vulture. And from that perspective, it's a revenge, it's a punishment, it is a torment that is never ending to the end of times. And when I think about it, I just feel that is a terrible, terrible story of punishment. But if you think about it, it's a punishment, and this is a beautiful, in my opinion, of course, a beautiful way to understand, right? It's a terrible form of telling the story of punishment of Prometheus. Who's Prometheus? He's a creation of the god, and Prometheus discovered fire, and oh, now he is able to bring light. And if you extrapolate the ability to create light, he now can illuminate Earth. And as he did that, he now became, have this new status of becoming a godlike, a deity himself. Okay. And we could go beyond, we're not going to do it, but we could go into a discussion about how when we accomplish something, it is our ego that thinks of Prometheus, right? We are now godlike. Look at me. I can be God. I can do this by our great accomplishment. Not going to talk about it, but it's very interesting to think about it, because as we continue to tell the story, which is a story about jealousy, right? And a very human passion of, I'm so jealous, I want to kill, but I don't want to just kill. I want to do something terrible because I'm so furious. And from that perspective, we can interpret this myth and it's a very, the book ends, if we can talk about the Prometheus and then Adam and Eve, because we can interpret this as the creator, right, desired that his creatures, so Zeus and Prometheus and God and Adam and Eve, right? So in the Greek mythology, the creator desired that his creature remained forever innocent, ignorant, dependent, and did not achieve. And I'm going to say this real slow because we're going to talk about it next, in the next chapters. Ethical consciousness, right? So if you're there, if you're innocent, you are ignorant, you're immature, you have no will because you cannot decide, therefore you are not ready for that consciousness that we as humans achieve. Prometheus did not have any discernment, so that he Zeus, in this case, drew all the satisfaction from being all powerful toward this creature, Prometheus. But again, we are all disobedient, and we talked about this last week, right? We are all curious, we're naive, but in our ascent toward our own maturity, we are inevitably fighting so that we can learn. And this fight within us gives us this very disobedient nature. And in this case, we can say, well, Prometheus, you brought this to yourself. You disobeyed. You did not do what was considered right. And we immediately think about Adam doing the same, right? Adam and Eve, where they ate from the fruit when they were told specifically, do not do that. And so um, Prometheus brought this. Ugh, despicable. He brought this, I would say, really terrible, undeserving punishment. All he did was he discovered fire and he felt, like he could be God himself. And if we again analyze this terrible punishment, now we start to see God in the form of Zeus as potentially very fallible, don't you think? It God can be furious. Again, it's an anthropomorphic view of what God is. God is this furious, passionate, and angry creature, right? He becomes very much like the creature that he God created. So in many, many ways, if you look at all the variations out there, we start to look and find, at least in my mind's eye, several representation of similar type of conflicts in different cultures, different traditions, and even different belief systems. And we could and we should perhaps judge these. Yes, God comes in and expel Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, right? Or Prometheus punishes. I'm sorry, Zeus punishes Prometheus from this eternal suffering, and we can say, well, that's very very immature, black and white. What about the evolution of thought of tentative? Can I do this? Can I try this way that really we human beings grow, right? So right now, and Joanna brings that to us. Well, this is quite immature way of bringing that content to us in a surface level. If we think about it, if we don't step and stop down to do deep dives of the real meaning of what those bring to us, they're very, very childish stories. And it's a representation of a punishment for anyone who disobeys. Well, interesting enough, think about and we talked about this before, but in the history of mankind, the history of thought and philosophy, it's closely aligned with the Industrial Revolution. René Descartes brings the Cartesian thought, and it's a very, very practical, pragmatic, and at that point, that type of thinking, much more realistic and pragmatic, in human centric, no longer uh, deity centric, we start to see the erosion of myths and storytelling as it was. And it really led to almost an obsolescence to the power of myths as storytelling to us. And as a result, collectively collectively speaking, we humans, we start to abandon the traditions, and those traditions, Joanna, includes the tradition of shamans, sorcerers, or even the myths of superstitions and myths of boogeyman, or even storks bringing babies, and also even the idea that we've seen permeated through history up to a point right now of fairy tales, fairy godmothers, genies, bad genies, good ones, guardian angels, all of that are part of our belief system. At least I was raised reading those stories. They start to really become a fantasy world that you don't believe anymore. Very magical, abstract word. And we come to where we are today, right? Yes, yes. Modern day society. We arrive at it, and I quote Joanna de Angelis when she says, nonetheless, when one almost believed myths to be extinct, considering the adult minds freed from them, so now we move from uh, becoming childlike and very immature in our storytelling into adult, very pragmatic, right? When we believe that we don't think like that anymore. Here comes technology and the media creating modern versions of them. Superman, action heroes, Martian invaders, Invisible Man, all fashioning extraordinary characters for combat in the name of everlasting goodness against relentless evil. I love it. And I checked on the dates just to see where we are because we are today, right, in the amazing victory of something called the Marvel Studios. Every year, or more than once a year, we have a movie out there, right, with a superhero or superheroes coming together to fight in their good and evil fights. And just for us to have a sense of timelines, Marvel Studios were found at the end of 1993. And right? If you think about it, with other superhero movies, it continues to be the driver for people for creating those stories and for people today going to the movies, to the theater. And 93, end of 93, it was actually December 93, this book was first published in 1991. So I love to see how contemporary Joanna de Angelis is. But Joanna de Angelis talks the fact not just a superhero, but also a different vein. Remember, René Descartes with the Cartesian thought was in the beginning of industrial revolution, right? But technology as a byproduct of that industrial revolution is omnipresent. And yes, Joanna always references technology. And so she brings the fact, the technology. And I'm thinking, forget about Marvel. I'm thinking about Blade Runner, right? Which is in the 1980s, early 80s, or the entire Terminator franchise. And that franchise I think has about six book movies now, but it started with the first one in the 80s as well, a little bit later than Blade Runner, but it's all really good examples of storytelling where our modern day myths focus no longer in superhero but also in robots with the same thing, right? Good versus evil. What is humanity in all of it? The idea of robotics and artificial intelligence now has created scenarios for our imagination to expand into the mythological area. Electronic devices, whatever shape or form, are the new winning heroes. Yes, Joseph Campbell, the journey of a hero is that of the Terminator, right? It's a robot, and they're the ones who are the victors in the ever present fighting of humanity, right? Those competitions. And I stop here, pause here to just ask you, do you think that this imagery in fantasy, and I'm talking about robotics, right? The robots, has turned fiction into our close reality of today? Well, let's think about it. From Orwell's 1984, which was written in um, right in the 1948, so post World War II era, or the Jetsons that was in the early 60s, or even beautiful movie I, Robot from the early 2000s, have all those images have been so ingrained that is perhaps leading our youth to start to confuse their possibilities with this fantastic accomplishments that is given to us by our fantasy. Hmm, what you think? Let's think about what are the examples of this magic thinking, right? And we can see them when we start to imitate heroes from comic books, or we start to emulate or display behaviors found in personalities in the box office, theater, radio, movies, television. And I say see this because we're in the right in the midst of the phenomenon called uh, Barbie, the movie, where more and more you see pink, that vibrant pink color is popping up everywhere we go, and a lot of interesting discussions. But it's the same, right? It's the same where we start to embrace certain behaviors. And what about our notion of immortality, not immortality of the soul, but immortality of the body, our physicality, right? Where some of us may think that we are either indestructible or our bodies are changeable in some um, technological engineering, and the thing that comes to my mind is body modifications that is rampant, right? And it is at this point that I say, whoa, we're back to the beginning. Perhaps in some ways, maybe we have regressed to the period where gods used in our imagination to descend to earth in humanized form, right? So Zeus was very much like a man, and those wizards and all of those that had the mystical abilities to solve any and all challenges that we faced. Is there a problem with that though? Well, the problem, remember what I said, Joanna is lovely because she brings the good, the bad, and the ugly, or in my own personal vocabulary, she brings the point and counterpoint. Whatever we do, there is also the other side of the coin. And she asks us, right, what are the problems? Well, it may lead to a superficial culture, right? And that superficial culture may lead to rather impactful and potentially negative ethical results. It may lead to the idea of normalizing violence, if you think about it, that the quote unquote warriors, modern day warriors, are now able to access equipment to avenge in the name of justice. And we're seeing that quite frequent, this type of behavior. And we also can see that we humans, if we buy into that magical thinking that we should confront the sources of evil and unjust society, and we become activists, and we start to see this polarized um, society full of people fighting for what they believe is just or not just. And so at that point, we say, yes, Joanna, you are right. There are problems with going back to the magical thinking. They're really positive, but there are problems as well. And if we continue to reflect upon, we see that personal experience, right, the results of our own ethical accomplishment may not be as powerful as this magical world fabricated by, collectively speaking, our heightened imagination, and may lead to grotesque, Prometheus like type of punishment that has been normalized. So let us just be reminded here that modern day myths, ironically, may undermine the spiritual maturity that we are talking in this book, that we need to seek to reach our true higher level of consciousness, which is the inner divine, the inner sacred, the God that truly exists within all of us. So, as we discussed previously, the collapse of industrial individualism, right? The decadence of the notion of social or socialist collectivism, they all feed to the new forms of statements and affirmations where our personal unconscious projects into those myths and start to seize, to create a reality that is intermingled with those illusions. So the question here is, are qualities, and I'm going to call it virtues, right? Behaviors are behaviors that lead to our higher self, acceptable or no longer acceptable in this idea, this type of society. So as we wrap it up, we say, well, right, we are all longing for peace. And as a matter of fact, I've been reading several modern renditions of the stories that reference biblical mythology. And it's so cool to see Joanna de Angelis bringing the Garden of Eden, which she references as a biblical mythology, and highlights them, right? So Adam and Eve comes to us in the form of great satisfaction of eating the sinful fruit, right? And what it does is that story, that myth, transforms punishment, if we think about it, right? So the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? It transforms the idea of punishment into pleasure and defines um, our relationship through that. Yes, we are going to continue to display insubordination to this God who punishes the all of us for our awakening of our consciousness. Whoa, it is interesting because we are all indeed longing for peace, not punishment. And as we reevaluate our modern lives, our modern myths, ancient myths, or biblical myths oppose, right, our imagination, are in direct opposition to our daily lives, right? We are tired, we're weary, we are fatigued, we are sick, we are afraid, we are anxious, we are having difficulties with the notion of aging and dying. And that is our reality. And that pushes us to the notion of let's look at life in a more mature instead of childish interpretation of those stories. So Joanna de Angelis just provides this beautiful invitation to tell us point counterpoint, right? Tell us that let's look about values that should represent those aspirations, those ideals in life, because loneliness and anxiety, which myths talking about it, but talk about with this veiled language that actually obscure them, they do not solve. They burst through this armor that many of us see, this behavior that we see a lot today of indifference as a result of those deeply rooted identity of those myths. And they lead us to a process that is needed for the survival of our society, right? So it's important to understand it was created to help us deal with our basic fears and emotions, but it may obscure us from really understanding that they're talking about our inner journey, the journey of the hero. So let us think about it, because we are dealing with a reality that has so many symbols, right? And they are, if we look at them the correct way, we can see them in our everyday life. They teach us. They propel us to understand what are the components that we need to really achieve a state of happy and even peaceful coexistence. So, with that, I would like to say thank you. And I'd like to tell you that our peace of mind matters, right? And let us all look for how to achieve this happiness that is given to us. I thank you again for your time. And next week we will discuss self-discovery, which is again the first chapter of the third part of the book, which is called The Pursuit of Reality. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being with me in this discussion of this chapter of the book, The Integral Human Being. See you soon.